It is important that we capture the opportunity that urbanization brings on board to ensure inclusive, safe, and sustainable development. And for us to be able to achieve that, as you've rightly put it, we need to do 3 or 4 things. The first one is that we need to create an environment and space to allow citizens in the city to be part and parcel of the planning, of the decision making, of developing a vision for the future of the city and having a stake in actually achieving that vision. And from work that we've done, both with UN Habitat and with our partners, we realized that that calls for leadership and governance that enables that inclusive planning, but also space. And that is why we are advocating for local democracy, or a space within the city that allows this engagement to take place right from the neighborhoods into the systems of governance. And that means that when we talk about leadership or governance within the city, we mean policy leaders, whether at national and city level. We mean civil society, we mean private sector, we mean youth organizations, women organizations, and all the diverse groups, especially focusing on the marginalized in the communities. That's one. The second one, we need to establish systems so that what comes out of that overall discussion finally influences policy effectively. And we've heard voices from city dwellers who say that, yes, we are engaged in discussions, but finally when it comes to decisions, our views are not taken care of. So we need to ensure that the process of engagement finally it captures the key issues and that they guide the policies and also allocation of budgets. But we need to do so in a manner that, yes, captures the views of the people, but also recognizes the value of research and the value of standards and norms and principles that enable urbanization to create wealth. Just to give you a practical example, since time immemorial, it's been indicated that for a city to be sustainable, you need to have at least 35 to 40% of public space allocated, of land allocated to public space. And you need to do so from the very beginning and protect that land. Now, should that be a negotiated factor? I think it should be an issue of engaging and explaining to people what this public space means, because it means that they have been able to allocate this land so that they can have sufficient space for infrastructure, for schools, for education, but also importantly, just for space, public space, green spaces like I'm seeing here in Singapore, for them to be able to engage. So they need to understand that, and that is not something that we should feel like it's for some cities and not others. And because of that, we feel that there has to be a common agenda where member states actually convene to discuss how this common agenda is being fostered. And we want to thank governments and their partners who decided on goal number 11 that now defines how do you achieve sustainable cities and human settlements and defines all this elaborately. The third part is having clear national policies to support that, because we realize that for cities to be healthy and to address inclusive, sustainable development, there has to be linkages clearly between urban areas and rural areas. So you have to have urban-rural linkages. We have to have clarity between, in an integrated planning manner, between the capital cities, intermediate towns, up to the smallest centers of human settlements. And you also need to do so from an approach that looks at governance, legislation, especially on land, urban planning and design as another angle, and then urban economy and municipal financing as a third angle, so that it's an integrated approach that actually becomes a driver of economic planning of the city or of the country. Now, together with that at national level, we need to ensure that it's implementable. And we've realized that in many parts of the world, urbanization is copy-pasted. You cannot do that. It has to have context, and every place has its own character. So it's important that what we have as policy is implementable at the right level, and that's at local government level. So there has to be allocation of leadership, of authority, of decentralization in terms of especially resources, and of follow-up. And at local government level, we need to have proactive planning for that. And we are seeing that many times planning is also sectoralized. We are talking about planning in an integrated manner in around the 3 areas that I talked about, whether governance or planning and planning and design or the urban economy as the foundation upon which you now bring in housing and the other basic services. So it's along these 3 areas that will be able to address the issue of inequality, which finally, to an ordinary person outside there, I would like to have access to, equitable access to public services, to basic infrastructure, to education, to mobility, to health, to public space, to job opportunities, and these are the fruits and outcomes of really good policies and implementation of those policies. Well, urbanization is a huge opportunity today, but it's conditional. It will only be a huge opportunity if we lead it to be so. And for that to happen, we need to plan for the current, but importantly, we need to plan for the long term. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the process of urbanization in terms of character and form and pace now? What will it be like 20 years from now? And what is leadership going to do, especially public, to lead it into in such a manner that it is people-centered and that it is as inclusive as you just mentioned and sustainable. So we need to have right integrated national policies that are also supported with the right level of capacity to plan for that proactively at local government level. That's one key corner. The second point is that we need to enhance our partnerships and networks, because it's a very vibrant process. And it's a process that can only work effectively if the right stakeholders are on the table from the word go, which means that even in the development of policy, government needs to engage the private sector, needs to engage civil society, needs to engage its own people. So partnerships and participation are very key to ensuring that it turns it into an opportunity. I think the third thing is to combine the social political driver with the economic aspect of it. Because we've seen that in the last 40 years, there's been a lot of focus on, say, addressing the issue of poverty and inequality, but not necessarily linking it to the job creation that the other side does provide. So it's important that we create inherent factors that will help it to be scalable, that will help it to be financially viable, but at the same time also socially and politically sound. And it's important that we bring on these bridges and networks together earlier on in the process. And I think that the final one is we need to look at it as a living thing, because it evolves. And so people should be willing to learn from one another, exchange views. And that's why we are here with African leaders to have some training and for them to share the experience, but also learn, from what Singapore has been able to achieve. Not that we would like them to go and copy-paste Singapore, but just to ask ourselves, what is it that Singapore did right that we can maybe take one or two things? What is it that amongst themselves as African countries can also learn from one another? And what is it that we as UN Habitat from a global perspective can share with them in terms of what we have been able to see work out? And that is from a very practical but also a research-based perspective. The willingness to learn and the willingness to take risks to change and be able to measure that progress and share best practices along the way is, I think, a cornerstone to turning it into a driver of socioeconomic transformation. I believe we build leadership in as far as urbanization is concerned at various levels, because it calls for coordination and coherence. we need to build leadership around government level, national level, and that leadership needs to be anchored within a good understanding of the science of urbanization. What is it that you need to do in terms of planning for urbanization and investing in urbanization to make it sustainable? But also the art of urbanization. How do you engage? How do you bring people together from diverse fields of expertise and cultures to have a common goal and vision? So that the art and the science of it has to come clearly and be transformed into a policy. And that needs to be led by government, because it's public policy, and it's important that government takes the lead and the regulation on defining that which government is in charge of and that which belongs to the private individual and the rest of the other stakeholders. But that also has to be clearly anchored within supporting implementation at local level. Depending on government, I think for Singapore it's easier because it's a city-state. But many places where we work, you have government, and then you have provinces, and then you have local government, and all these levels of government have ways they look at things differently. What we've observed is that in many cases, they look at it from a sectoral perspective, which is not very healthy. It's good for one to be specialized, but before you get into urban planning or land, you need to understand the bigger picture. So there is need for that holistic leadership at local government level so that it can be able to support the implementation of policy from an integrated perspective. There is need for leadership to communicate effectively and in a manner that is also understandable to the ordinary person at community level. So we need leadership in a polycentric manner, but leadership that also is going to capture the voices, as I had mentioned, at community level amongst the different stakeholders, whether private sector, civil society, and international organizations. Then the fourth level, which is very important, and that's how we come in as the UN, is the global or regional integrated level. And that brings in the international community, the multilateral organizations, and other global institutions. And that, I think I must say, is a huge opportunity now that we have got a global development agenda that was endorsed last year, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. We have got the agenda on climate change. Again, it's a very positive move, and the role of cities in ensuring sustainable development and addressing climate change is very clear. We have got a common agenda on urbanization and human settlements in the form of the new urban agenda. So all this creates a platform for leadership. So leaders will be meeting every year to decide on or to assess how they have progressed in terms of implementing this development agenda. And the role of urbanization is quite very well articulated. So the importance of this kind of leadership is that it will create a platform for, one, monitoring progress, exchanging what is worked out very well, learning also from failure, building networks and partnerships for moving forward in terms of implementing and creating really business in the long run. So we need to have that vertical and horizontal leadership to forge the way forward. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think we can say that every member state is going to see this in exactly the same way. But a good thing is we have developed also tools to enable some level of comparative analysis. And so what we are doing now, which we didn't have like 5 years ago, we're saying we want to be able to support member states to assess sustainable development at national level, but importantly at local government level. And so we've developed a tool that we call the City Prosperity Initiative, which now defines what is prosperity at national level, but importantly, what's prosperity at city level, because it's actually at city level that you're going to find the detail through the disaggregated data as to what has gone wrong and how it can be corrected. So we believe again in this sense that Singapore has a stake. Singapore has been a friend of ours in this journey. It established what is called the Friends of Sustainable Cities in New York with the permanent missions. And through this informal engagement, member states from Rio +20 were able to identify the importance of cities and human settlements as a component, a driver of sustainable development. And finally, I think 2 years ago when I was here for the World Cities Summit, they had mobilized mayors, 120 mayors signed a statement to the Secretary General advocating for a standalone goal on sustainable cities and human settlements. As part of the overall campaign towards the Sustainable Development Agenda, finally the goal, the standalone goal, was endorsed. It's now our job to support that to be realized. And I'm happy to note that again, Singapore has gone ahead. We've engaged last year in Quito when we were finalizing the new urban agenda. We signed an agreement that we are going to work, we as UN Habitat, with the government of Singapore to support member states who are interested in actually really realizing through capacity building and experience sharing. And that is why we're here, as I mentioned. So it is work in progress, but I can say that there are tangible results that are going to come out of this. Thank you. Well, that's a very nice one. I believe that urban planning is more of, as I mentioned, there is the science of it. But if it's to be useful and viable, it has to be centered around the people. What we have been doing in our work is to streamline the issues of gender and women empowerment, in the sense that, first of all, we need to ensure that in the overall process of planning, women and girls are part and parcel of that process, and their views are taken care of. Because many times we find that the technical work is done, and then towards the end of the project, then you start asking yourself, well, what is the gender perspective? No, women and girls we have different ways we relate to our space. Right from morning, if you look at how do you spend your time and what do you do, between the boys and girls, between women and men, it's different. So you need to capture that and then plan in such a manner that it enables them, that it enables and it does handle or address the bottlenecks that have been obstructive and hindering girls and women to be able to participate actively in the life and the well-being of the city, and also not being able to access the opportunities. So if I just practically, the two areas that we see that have been really challenging for them is the time, because we have a lot of work that is being done by women and girls that is not given value financially, especially in the care industry. And so it's taken for granted that whether back at home or taking care of the elderly or the children, the cooking and all these things, somehow traditionally, they are not as much valued as the formal jobs. And yet they take quite a lot of their time. So you find that if you don't plan if you plan for a denser city, if you plan for a city that helps, to move around, that is one thing. But you also need to create policies that give value to these activities so that actually they can be able to benefit from them. Then when it comes to the issue of safety and security, we realize that especially in terms of perception, especially for the girls, a good number of cities, they may appear like they're safe, but people don't feel safe in the same way, whether along the streets or in terms of public transport. And we are seeing that gender-based violence needs to be mapped, and the mapping has to depend upon the views of the people who feel affected by the issue. So when it comes to planning, how do we enhance the safety, accessibility of the women and girls to these public spaces, to public services and infrastructure, to the education, to the health that they need, and at any time that they need it? You need to hear from them, and then that should guide your planning. So we believe that when you engage with them, again through the different fora where they are, then it enhances the quality of the planning that we see. I must say that we've had a lot of good participation from the various sectors, whether private sector, civil society, academia in the area, and also within the UN through our sister agencies, to ensure that the final documents that were endorsed, like the new urban agenda and the 2030 agenda, is clearly strong on the issue of empowerment of women and gender equality. Well, density is important for cities because it's within density that cities create wealth. And density is not in the long run as costly as we want to put it. Actually, it's much more expensive to have sprawl. When we say that urbanization brings opportunity, why does it bring opportunity? It brings opportunity because it brings us closer together. And so that level of agglomeration that comes with density, especially if that density is planned well, because you can have a high density and not feel choked because there's space. The planning and design allowed for that to happen. But also within that density, you have intentionally brought together different mixed use and socioeconomic mix, not to disintegrate people. So when we get together, then the different skills and maybe opinions we have, whether debates, creativity, innovation, is much more enhanced. Every one of us in life needs different services during the course of the day. You want a meal, you can have it. You want a paper, you can read it. You want to have fun, you can go to, you can have all the different packages in a much less space. You spend less time and you do much better when you agglomerate. So it's within densification, better planned densification and integrated densification, that we're able to get the economies of agglomeration. That's one. Then it's through densification that actually we're able to increase the value of space in a city. And that is why when you designate and say, I'm sure you can imagine, if you took the value of this land here in the city and compared it to another place that is less dense, this will certainly be much higher. Why? Because its value increases with densification, especially if it's well planned. So it's within density that the creation of the value of space is actually captured and at the same time shared. And I think the challenge I see that we are having is that people are thinking about urbanization from an individualistic perspective. Private sector, where there is no good public policy, looks for cheap land. So they get out of the city, they get a chunk of land and they want to build developments. But that doesn't help them in the long run to look at the perspective of the value of their own property. Because the value of property actually is much more dependent upon the inherent value of the location, which you only get when you have densification. So that when government or public invests in public infrastructure, it enhances the value of the infrastructure, but importantly, it also enhances the value of the private infrastructure. And in so doing, when private infrastructure is able to capture that value, invest, then government can collect taxes, which taxes are used to invest more in infrastructure and increase. So it becomes a cycle. What we've been seeing is that when you don't look at it that way, then it ceases being an engine and becomes dependent upon aid or upon, you invest in a lot of money, especially in infrastructure, which you're not able to sustain in terms of, getting benefits out of that. So that is why densification is very important. But what we've been seeing, which I think was very well elaborated by Mr. Koo yesterday, there are two challenges to densification. The first one is oftentimes there's a cultural disincentive. And there's been a saying that mainly maybe Africa, because we come from maybe rural settings, that's not true only, because we're actually seeing that even in developed economies, the current state of urbanization is sprawling. By nature, people want big swimming pools, want big backyards and compounds, big trees and everything, but they don't realize that in so doing, they're actually doing, they're spending a lot much more on energy, we are consuming unsustainably. So the problems of climate change and everything are actually aligned to that desire of ours for this insatiable space that doesn't help. Again, that is like showcasing that at the back of our minds, if we don't have a control system, we are likely to be much more wasteful than wise in what we spend. The second point on densification is that we are wasting a resource that is inelastic, and that is land. Today, the pace at which urbanization is taking place is actually taking much more arable land than it did years ago. And what does that mean? It's certainly going to influence our food security. It is going to affect, because now we are even sprawling into ecologically sensitive areas. It is challenging the way we are utilizing the natural resources that we have. We cannot afford squandering land by just sprawling all over the place. I think the third point in terms of the issue of densification is around creating ways of bringing unity and cohesion, what here you refer to in many places probably as diversity. You're a very diverse community. Singaporeans, I believe you come from different backgrounds, but by virtue of your policies, you have used densification to build a one state and one mindset. And I think that's very beautiful. Cities worldwide, by character, are composed mainly of people from different backgrounds. But there has to be a way this difference of background is given space to interact. And that interaction needs to be close enough to cause healthy conflict. But at the same time, come out realizing that, we may be different, but we've got quite some very good common factors that we need to stick to. We are Singaporeans. We will defend our country. We want to feel valued here, but you also have a stake in doing this. And you do that with that level of agglomeration much more than when you are too sparse.